think of radical embodiment as having like three parts: a conceptual part, a philosophical part, and a methodological part. The conceptual part is to try to understand humans and human minds as continuous with nature, which is to say that, you know, our experience isn't walled off from or separate from the world around us and from other creatures. The philosophical part is that this ends up basically, because of the kind of state of cognitive science in the 21st century, this ends up with us rejecting the idea that all of our experience occurs in terms of internal mental representations of the world. So sometimes it's just called anti-representationalism, the view. The methodological part is what's called dynamical systems theory, and the idea is to try to explain how whole creatures in their environments change over time, not reductionist, not about just their brains, but about animals in the environment. So those three things collectively are what I think of as radical embodied cognition. So yeah, that's the methodological part. The idea being that in order to study human behavior, we don't want to just zoom in on human brains or brain areas. What we want to look at is a brain in a body in an environment, and a brain and multiple bodies in an environment. So basically engagement with the environment, and also engagement with others. Those become the kind of central focus of the discipline instead of the information processing that might be done in brains.
I tend to try to answer or reflect on questions from a historical perspective, and that's how I'll try to answer your question. So the history of Western philosophical thought is filled with divisions, with dichotomies. And one of the dichotomies has been the body and what's historically called the mind or the soul. And so going back centuries, we've sort of looked at mental processes and thinking, perceiving on the one hand, but then sort of functions of the body on the other. But embodied cognition tries to overcome that dichotomy in that all of our experiences are embodied. So in other words, when we're perceiving, it certainly affects not just what happens in our brain, but also our body, and we use our body to perceive and move around and think. So there's really not a discontinuity between body and mind, but a continuity. It stands to reason, therefore, that things that we learn about less complex organisms could give us insights into ourselves. But there are differences. And one of the interesting, important differences is our ability to think and speak symbolically. And so we need to try to understand thinking and speaking symbolically from a more of an embodied approach. And I think that's really where a lot of the interesting and new work is going on right now. When I've talked about development, so far I've been referring to sort of evolutionary change or evolutionary continuity, but also there's change over the course of a lifespan. Yeah, so in the case of human development, and I'm particularly interested in that. You know, how does the individual develop over time, given the environment that individual happens to be in? And so much of the work of this group is to look at the relationship between environments that humans develop in and the development of embodied cognition.
Well, I think it's an interesting question about what embodiment is, because the only reason we talk about embodiment really is in contrast to something that is not embodiment, so in contrast to disembodiment, so the term, it has a historical meaning. So when we talk about embodied cognition, we're rejecting a disembodied approach to cognition, and we're specifically rejecting sort of old-fashioned artificial intelligence, symbolic artificial intelligence, but also sort of connectionist artificial intelligence from the 1950s through to the 1980s, 90s. That's where the term comes from. I sometimes think, well, maybe we should stop talking about embodiment. Maybe it's not that useful to sort of still be defining what we're doing in opposition to something that was happening sort of 30, 40 years ago. Maybe a better term is just ecological cognition or ecological psychology, because it's a positive way of identifying what the discipline is. We're interested in cognition as something that happens at the ecological scale, so at the scale of interactions between organisms and the structures around them.
Para mí la corporización, que justo en español tiene como esta doble acepción de corporizar y encarnar, ¿no? Tiene que ver justamente con deshacerse de la idea de representación mental para estudiar los fenómenos cognitivos y centrarse básicamente en las interacciones entre el organismo y el ambiente. Entonces algo que es muy importante es tomar en cuenta las capacidades sensoriomotoras de los organismos y los niveles de interacción que se dan con el ambiente. Entonces básicamente yo trabajo 3 niveles o dimensiones de interacción. Uno que es simplemente, digamos, la interacción per se, que es el estar, digamos, en un momento acoplado con algo en el ambiente, ¿no? Luego viene el nivel de transacción, que es como un nivel más profundo, que ya tiene que ver con que el cuerpo va generando patrones sensoriomotores para interactuar con los ambientes, y luego viene el constitutivo, ¿no? No son excluyentes ninguno de los 3, pero son niveles de interacción. El constitutivo tiene que ver ya con que no se puede generar un tipo de cognición sin un ambiente específico, ¿no? Entonces el ambiente se vuelve parte, como lo dice su nombre, constitutivo o de una causalidad recíproca muy basada en teorías de sistemas dinámicos para poder entender qué es la cognición. Eso nos deshace completamente la idea clásica de representación mental y nos aleja del cerebrocentrismo, porque para tomar en cuenta las interacciones tenemos que generar justamente un análisis de todo el cuerpo y de cómo todo el cuerpo, incluido el cerebro obviamente y los patrones neurológicos, como todo el cuerpo interactúa con los distintos ambientes. Y en los ambientes, ¿no? También podemos discernir los ambientes de desarrollo, ¿no? Los ambientes como nichos, ¿no? Nichos ontogénicos o nichos culturales o nichos de herencia, que se mezcla también con los sistemas de desarrollo biológicos.
The brain is really important for cognition, for thinking, for acting in the world, but it is situated in a body. So it's in a skull that's located on a neck, that's on shoulders, on a body with legs that's moving in a world, right? So that's a little bit more getting towards the radical end. A little bit further along is to say that, yes, the brain is in a body and the body is moving in the world. The brain receives input from the body and from the environment, but maybe some parts of the body are really important for causing certain cognitive states. So maybe the direction or movement of my hand might help me to count. So I might externalize the representation of numbers or quantities in my fingers, and this is something you see developmentally in children. I'm not quite a child, I'm a little bit older than a child, but I still count with my fingers sometimes. I'm like, how many bananas did I put in my bag? And this is a kind of embodiment, right? And externalizing from the brain into the body a representation of quantity. Go a little bit further towards the more radical end, and we might say, when I'm counting, I'm not externalizing a sort of causally relevant feature of my body to help my brain represent quantities, but that representation of quantities is actually in my fingers, right? So the number 4 is part of my hand, and that's how I'm processing that quantity. So as we start getting further and further towards radical embodiment, what we find is that we are decentralizing cognition, intelligence, thinking, mind, from being a brain-centric phenomenon. So it's not just what's in between your ears, but we're saying causally the body's really important, the environment is really important, but also constitutively. So what makes the phenomenon what it is, right?
general, you know, for the past 70 years, people were thinking about cognition more or less in terms of a computer and processing information. So it's very disembodied. It's just like our brain does all the work, which is simply not true. In ecological psychology, for example, we study not so much information processing by the brain, but how an organism is coordinating with the environment, both physical environment and social environment, as we are doing now in conversation or interview. So this is a totally different perspective, not putting in focus just one big processing device like your brain, but taking into consideration everything, your body, how it is, how your cognition and perception, action are realized in your body, and how this body is coordinated with the entire world. And that's why this meeting is so important, I think, at this moment, because we are departing slowly from this metaphor of brain as a computer, as an information processor, and we go towards seeing the brain as being part of our body, which it is, right? Immersed in the environment. And it's really very important now when we have a lot of artificial systems built using computational methods, and then we can see how we are different from those computational systems, we humans, with our emotions, with our relations among each others. So this is why this conference will be, for me, very, very important, because it will give me a lot of support to think differently about cognition.